than a political campaign. It is a call to arms. Give me your help, not to win votes alone, but to win in this crusade to restore America.
The election of FDR over his non-interventionist opponent, Herbert Hoover, enabled socialist economic action in the form of the New Deal. The benefits of this radical policy changed and persisted throughout American history. At the start of the 1930s, the United States was experiencing an economic recession on an unprecedented scale. The Great Depression was disastrous for the American people and economy. Unemployment was at a historic high and wages were constantly dropping. In addition, millions of Americans lost their life savings in failing banks. Despite the suffering, the U.S. government was reluctant to take action. President Hoover underestimated the magnitude of the recession. His mismanagement of the Great Depression ruined his reputation and popularity. In the presidential election of 1932, Hoover was soundly beaten by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who promised radical new policies designed to help the struggling public. There are a multitude of factors and events that led to and worsened the Great Depression. The stock market crash of 1929 is often associated with the start of the recession. In a short window, the value of the stocks on the New York Stock Exchange decreased by a third. The average American did not have money in the stock market, so the crash alone would not have triggered the Great Depression. According to Mary Hansen, professor of economics at American University, the stock market crash did two things. It had a wealth effect on consumption, and it also made consumers and firms pessimistic. Americans were anxious about their financial security and started to reduce spending. This was catastrophic for industry and agriculture, which were already in decline due to lack of demand and foreign competition. Companies began to cut wages and lay off employees. As the U.S. economy began to spiral out of control, people began to withdraw all their money from banks. Some small banks did not have the money to pay out all of their customers and shut down as a result. Once banks started failing, Americans panicked and rushed to withdraw their money, causing more banks to fail. Families lost everything, and the government did nothing to compensate them. Throughout the start of the Great Depression, President Hoover was confident that the recession would be short-lived. In a speech on May 1, 1930, Hoover stated, "I am convinced we have passed the worst, and with continued effort, we shall rapidly recover." His policies towards combating the recession reflected this optimism. Hoover believed that the economy would naturally rebound and government intervention would be counterproductive. He was reluctant to give the struggling public any kind of governmental aid because he expected Americans to persevere instead of relying on handouts. In addition to these passive policies, Hoover signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in June of 1930. The act raised the prices of foreign products so that American products would have an advantage. Other nations retaliated and U.S. international trade was reduced by over 60%. By the time Hoover began to intervene with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and the Federal Home Loan Bank Act, his popularity was already rock bottom. Franklin Delano Roosevelt won the 1932 election by a landslide. Once he took office, he immediately started to pass legislation and created the first New Deal. The New Deal was a series of programs and acts that FDR implemented between 1933 and 1939 that were aimed towards aiding Americans during the Great Depression. They were made with the hope that they would stop the downward spiral of the American economy and employment rate. The start of FDR's presidency was known as the 100 Days. Within those 3 months of him being president, FDR started to carry out the first New Deal by introducing new and helpful agencies. On March 31, 1933, the Civilian Conservation Corps was created to employ young men to work on public land and conservation projects. They also worked on erosion, flood control, and pest control. Within the first 3 months of its creation, the CCC employed 275,000 people, and when the CCC was discontinued in 1942, they had enrolled around 3 million people total, and they had planted 2.3 billion trees across the U.S. Also during FDR's 100 Days, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration was also created. Its goal was to create new jobs in state government that didn't require a lot of background knowledge and skill. The FDR employed about 20 million people until it was replaced in 1935 by the WPA. On June 16, 1933, FDR's 100th day as president, FDR signed the Banking Act of 1933, which created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. The FDIC is a government corporation that reassured the American people that in case their bank failed, they would be compensated. Due to this feeling of security, the number of bank runs was greatly reduced, which resulted in fewer banks failing. In 1933, 4,000 banks had failed. In 1934, after the FDIC was implemented, only 9 banks failed, which is a 99.78% decrease. The New Deal provided unheard of amounts of governmental relief. Before the Great Depression, the federal government did little to help people during the recessions. As a whole, it wasn't as powerful or as involved in American lives. Throughout FDR's presidency, he increased the power and responsibilities of the government. FDR's right-wing critics call him a radical socialist and the New Deal unconstitutional. The Supreme Court struck down several acts that they deemed illegitimate. Despite his opposition, FDR continued to fundamentally change the role of the federal government. In the words of David Kennedy, award-winning author of Freedom from Fear, the New Deal changed people's expectations of government and changed the whole schedule, you might say, of our expectations about what is legitimate for the government to do. The lasting impacts of the New Deal reach beyond strengthening the federal government. The reforms FDR implemented still benefit Americans today. The Wagner Act and the Social Security Act of 1935, along with the Works Progress Administration established during the New Deal era, greatly shaped American society by implementing fundamental rights for workers. The Wagner Act gave workers the promise of organizing unions, as well as the ability to bargain collectively, which improved the conditions for millions of Americans.
The National Labor Relations Bill I introduced is not new in principle. It is based upon the long-cherished American belief that every worker should be a free man in fact as well as in name, should be free to belong to any kind of union that he likes. My bill guarantees this economic freedom in the clearest terms.
Since workers were now granted the ability to unionize and negotiate better wages with their employers, it balanced out the power in terms of labor relations. Similarly, the Social Security Act provided assistance to the elderly, the unemployed, the dependent children, making it easier to set up social welfare policies. President FDR also created the WPA in the hopes to reduce unemployment and begin the recovery of the economy by employing millions of Americans in public work projects. Through WPA, he created schools, hospitals, bridges, and roads which helped the country develop even further by providing necessary infrastructure. In total, the WPA programs produced 650,000 miles of roads, 125,000 public buildings, 75,000 bridges, 8,000 parks, and 800 airports. The lasting impacts of the WPA, Wagner Act, and Social Security Act accomplished more than their original desires, fulfilling notable long-term results. Specifically, the WPA's work in infrastructure projects not only helped during the time of the New Deal, but also acted as a template for future development. FDR pioneered government response to recessions. In 1936, he received over 98% of the electoral vote, the widest electoral margin in the history of the United States. After re-election, he perfectly demonstrated the effectiveness of the New Deal. In 1938, he attempted to balance the budget and cut some funds to New Deal agencies, which promptly started a small recession. The agencies were necessary for recovery and changed the trajectory of American history. They provided jobs, relief, and hope to struggling families. In addition to the relief, reforms made during this period prevented catastrophic bank failures, revitalized American infrastructure and workers' rights. Americans benefited from these reforms long after the Great Depression ended. FDR and his New Deal left a lasting impact and irrefutable mark on America.